My name is Ezekiel Blackwood, commercial beekeeper turned survivor. When the dead started walking, I didn't have guns or bunkers, just my hives and knowledge of bee behavior. What began as a normal morning at an apple orchard became a desperate fight for survival as the zombie apocalypse erupted around me. I'm about to tell you how I used my bees to survive the first month when everyone else was dying. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I was checking on my hives at the Johnson apple orchard when the world ended. It was a warm April morning, the kind where dew still clings to the grass, but you know it's going to be hot by noon. My bees were happy, dancing their way between apple blossoms, doing the work they've done for millions of years. I suppose I should introduce myself properly. My name is Ezekiel Blackwood, Zeke to most folks. For 8 years, I worked as a park ranger at Yellowstone before switching to commercial beekeeping. I ran, I guess, a mobile apiary operation, moving my hives across the country to follow bloom cycles. Farmers paid good money for pollination services, and I sold specialty honey on the side. It was a good life, quiet, sustainable. That morning at the Johnson orchard was like any other. Tom Johnson was a reliable client, always paid on time, understood the value of my bees for his apple yield. His teenage son, Dylan, had been helping me all morning, asking smart questions about colony collapse and pollen counts. He was a bright kid, wanted to study agriculture in college. I was explaining how bees communicate through dancing when I heard the screams from the farmhouse. At first, I thought maybe Mrs. Johnson had burned herself in the kitchen. She'd been making apple butter when we started work that morning. But these screams were different, primal, filled with terror. I told Dylan to stay with the hives and ran toward the house. That's the first decision I still think about. If I'd taken him with me, could I have protected him? Or would we both have ended up dead? The screaming stopped abruptly when I was halfway to the house. What replaced it was worse, a wet, tearing sound that carried across the orchard. I slowed my approach, suddenly cautious. I grabbed my smoker, the metal can beekeepers use to calm bees, and held it like a weapon. It was heavy enough to do damage if needed. At the back porch, I found what was left of Mrs. Johnson. Tom was hunched over her body, tearing at her with bloody fingers, his movements jerky and wrong. When he turned toward me, his eyes were clouded over, milky white. He wasn't Tom anymore. He was something else. He made a sound no human should make and lunged at me. I backed away, but he came after me with surprising speed. The smoker connected with his skull before I even realized I'd swung it. He went down hard, but kept moving, trying to get up despite the dent in his head. No human should have been able to move after a hit like that. I hit him again, and again, until he stopped moving. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the smoker. I'd never killed anything bigger than a hornet before that day. I called for Dylan, suddenly remembering the boy. No answer. I ran back through the orchard, calling his name. When I reached my truck, I tried the radio. Nothing but emergency broadcasts and panicked reports from around the county. Similar attacks, people turning violent, biting others, the bitten becoming biters themselves within hours. The barn door was open. I called Dylan's name again, softer this time. I heard shuffling inside. Something scraped against concrete. I picked up a shovel leaning against the wall and stepped into the dim interior. Dylan was in the back corner, crouched over one of the farm dogs. His face and hands were covered in blood. When he looked up at me, his eyes had that same milky appearance as his father's. He snarled and started toward me, moving in that same wrong way. I raised the shovel but couldn't swing it. Not at Dylan. As he got closer, something unexpected happened. A small cluster of my bees had followed me into the barn, probably attracted to the sweat on my skin. As Dylan came within a few feet of me, the bees began to buzz agitatedly. He stopped, turning his head toward the sound. Then, remarkably, he changed direction, moving away from me and the bees. I backed out of the barn and secured the door with a piece of chain I found nearby. I didn't understand what had happened then, how the bees had seemingly diverted him. That discovery would save my life many times in the coming weeks. I had 3 options: drive to the nearest town for help, head home to my cabin in the hills, or wait it out at the orchard. Towns meant people. People meant potential infection. My remote cabin was a 3-day drive away. The orchard had food, water from the well, and my bees. I chose to stay, at least until I understood what was happening. That decision saved my life, while millions of others who fled to so-called safety in crowded cities were dead within days. I spent that first night in my truck, doors locked, windows up despite the heat. I watched distant fires burn on the horizon as night fell. Occasionally I heard screams carried on the wind. I had no idea then that my bees would become more than my livelihood. They'd become my survival strategy and eventually save dozens of lives. By morning, the radio broadcasts had become increasingly frantic. Government officials urged people to remain calm, to stay in their homes, that the National Guard was being deployed. But between official messages, radio hosts described scenes of carnage in cities, hospitals overwhelmed, police unable to contain the violence. From my vantage point at the orchard, I could see the highway about 2 miles away. It was gridlocked with cars trying to escape from the city. Even from that distance, I could occasionally see figures moving between vehicles, not walking, hunting. By the second day, I had developed a routine. Each morning, I checked on my hives, making sure they were secure and that the bees were active. Then, I'd scout the perimeter of the orchard, watching for any of the infected. I kept thinking about how Dylan had reacted to my bees in the barn. It wasn't a coincidence. When I approached the barn again to check on him, bringing more bees with me intentionally this time, he actively moved away from the buzzing. On the afternoon of the second day, I heard a car engine struggling. A blue minivan had pulled off the highway and was limping down the dirt road toward the orchard. The engine was smoking, clearly overheating. I grabbed my smoker and a jar of fresh honey, unsure if I'd need a weapon or an offering. A family of 4 emerged from the van: mother, father, and 2 children around 10 and 12. The father had his arm around the mother, supporting her. She was pale, sweating profusely. "Please," the man called out when he saw me. "My wife needs medicine. She's diabetic. We've been stuck on the highway for 18 hours. I kept my distance, watching for signs of infection. "Is she bitten?" I asked, keeping the smoker ready. "No, just hypoglycemic. We ran out of food." He was exhausted, desperate. I handed them the honey jar. "Give her 2 spoonfuls of this. It'll raise her blood sugar fast." While the woman took the honey, I eyed their van. Engines shot. "You won't make it another mile in that." "We were heading for my brother's farm in South Dakota," the man explained. His name was Richard. His wife was Anna. The kids were Ella and Jacob. "Is it safe here?" "Safer than the highway," I told them. I let them stay in Tom Johnson's house after I'd removed Mrs. Johnson's body and made sure it was secure. I didn't tell them about Tom or Dylan in the barn. That night, 3 infected individuals wandered into the orchard from the highway. I was checking on one of my hives when I spotted them. They moved with that distinctive shambling gait, drawn perhaps by the lights we'd kept on in the house. I was about to run and warn the family when I noticed something remarkable. The infected approached the hive I was working with, then suddenly diverted, moving around it in a wide arc. The bees were agitated by my presence, releasing alarm pheromones. The infected seemed repelled by this. Over the next 2 days, I conducted tests. I placed active hives at various points around the orchard perimeter. Without fail, the infected avoided these areas. When I used my smoker, which contains burlap that creates a specific scent to calm bees, the infected seemed disoriented, less aggressive. Richard helped me with these experiments while Anna recovered her strength. We discovered that a mixture of honey, bee propolis, a resinous material bees use to seal their hives, and certain herbs from Mrs. Johnson's garden created a paste that, when burned, would actually drive the infected away. "We need to tell people about this," Richard insisted. "Tell who?" I asked. "The radio's been silent for 12 hours now. The cell networks are down." By day 5, the traffic on the highway had thinned to nothing. The only movement was the infected, wandering aimlessly or occasionally pursuing some unseen target. We needed to leave the orchard. Food was running low, and the well pump needed electricity we no longer had. I had 10 hives with me, too many to transport easily without my specialized truck. I made the painful decision to consolidate, combining 5 hives into 3 stronger ones that would travel better. "You've got to come with us," I told Richard and his family. "Your best chance is to use what we've learned about the infected and the bees." We packed my truck with the strongest hives, our limited supplies, and the family. I fashioned crude protection for everyone using beekeeping veils and the propolis mixture applied to clothing. What I didn't realize then was that my methods would soon be tested against far larger hordes than I'd ever seen, and that not everyone would appreciate my slow, methodical approach. We headed north, avoiding main roads. I knew of an abandoned farm about 20 miles away, on high ground with good visibility. The previous owner had been an old friend who died the previous year. His children had been trying to sell the property but hadn't found a buyer. The journey took all day. Twice, we had to stop and use the bee-based repellents to divert infected away from the truck. Each time, I watched in fascination as they changed course, moving away from us as if pushed by an invisible force. The farm was untouched when we arrived. The solar panels my friend had installed were still functioning, providing limited electricity. The well was operational. Most importantly, it was isolated with clear sight lines in all directions. I set up my remaining hives and began more systematic testing. I extracted bee pheromones using equipment I'd had in my truck. I mixed different concentrations, testing their effectiveness on lone infected we could lure safely. One mixture worked better than the rest, a combination of alarm pheromones from guard bees and a unique compound found in the mandibular glands of worker bees. When applied to clothing or burned in a controlled manner, it created a perimeter the infected wouldn't cross. We established a small safe zone around the farmhouse. For the first time since the outbreak began, Richard's children played outside without fear. Anna's health improved with regular food and lower stress. On day 7, we spotted smoke rising from the direction of the nearest town about 5 miles away. Through binoculars, I could see movement, not infected, but people. Organized, purposeful movement. "Should we make contact?" Richard asked. I hesitated. More people meant more resources, more protection. But it also meant more potential for conflict, for disagreement about how to survive. I'd grown attached to my methodical, bee-centered approach. Would others see its value, or dismiss it as too slow, too strange? "Tomorrow," I decided, "we'll approach carefully, bringing evidence of what we've discovered." That night, I prepared additional pheromone mixtures and organized my notes on infected behavior. If there were other survivors establishing a community, my unique knowledge might prove valuable enough to secure us a place among them. What I couldn't know then was how desperately people would eventually fight over different survival strategies, or how my bees would become both our greatest protection and a target for those who didn't understand their value. We approached the town cautiously the next morning. Richard and I went alone, leaving Anna with the children at the farm. We carried small jars of the bee repellent mixture as both protection and proof of our discovery. From half a mile out, we could see that the survivors had established their base at the local high school. They'd created barricades using school buses and had lookouts posted on the roof. They spotted us before we got within 300 yards. A woman with a rifle approached, keeping a safe distance. "Stop right there," she called. "Are either of you bitten or scratched?" "We're clean," I answered. "We've been surviving at a farm east of here. We saw your smoke yesterday." She studied us carefully, then spoke into a walkie-talkie. A few minutes later, 2 more people approached. A tall man with the sheriff's badge and an older woman wearing a white coat over casual clothes. "I'm Dr. Elena Patel," the older woman introduced herself. "This is Sheriff Garza. We need to examine you before you come into our compound." The examination was thorough. Dr. Patel checked us for fever, bites, scratches, any sign of infection. When she was satisfied, Sheriff Garza escorted us inside the perimeter. The high school had been transformed. Classrooms had become living quarters. The cafeteria served as a communal dining area. The gymnasium stored supplies. About 40 people had gathered here, Sheriff Garza explained. Some were locals, others had been passing through when the outbreak occurred. "We've established a system," he told us. "Everyone contributes according to their skills. We have security teams, food production, medical care. What can you offer?" I showed them my jars of bee pheromone mixture. "The infected avoid bees," I explained. "More specifically, they're repelled by certain pheromones bees produce. I can create barriers that they won't cross." Dr. Patel looked skeptical. Sheriff Garza laughed outright. "Bee spray? That's your contribution? We have guns, man." "Guns run out of ammunition," I countered. "Bees keep producing pheromones indefinitely, and they'll help pollinate crops if you're planning to stay here long term." Dr. Patel's interest was piqued. "It's worth testing," she said. "If nothing else, it could be a backup system." The test was arranged for the following day. Richard returned to bring Anna and the children to the school, while I retrieved 2 of my stronger hives. Sheriff Garza had 3 deputies take a captured infected individual to the football field. They had it chained, but it was still dangerous. I set up my hives on one side of the field. When they were active, I extracted pheromones using my equipment and created a line across the middle of the field using the mixture. The deputies released the infected, keeping it controlled with long poles. As the infected approached the invisible line, its behavior changed. It became agitated, then diverted, moving along the line rather than crossing it. The crowd of onlookers murmured with surprise. "Do it again," Sheriff Garza demanded. We repeated the test 3 times. Each time, the infected refused to cross the pheromone barrier. By the final demonstration, even the skeptics were convinced. "How quickly can you produce this stuff?" Sheriff Garza asked. "Not quickly," I admitted. "It's a careful process. But I can train others. And if we establish more hives, production increases." That was the beginning of my integration into the high school community. Dr. Patel gave me a classroom to use as a laboratory. Several people volunteered to learn beekeeping basics. I retrieved my remaining hives from the farm and set them up on the school roof and in the courtyard. Dr. Patel took a particular interest in my work. She'd been a research physician before the outbreak and saw scientific potential in understanding why the infected responded to bee pheromones. "Their neurological systems are still functioning, just rewired," she explained as we worked together extracting pheromones. "Something about these compounds triggers an avoidance response. If we can understand why, maybe we can develop stronger deterrents." Our working relationship quickly deepened into something more. Elena, as she asked me to call her, was brilliant, practical, and one of the few people who fully grasped the long-term value of my bee-based approach. While Sheriff Garza focused on immediate security through conventional means, Elena and I worked on sustainable solutions. By the end of the second week, we'd established a complete perimeter around the school using my pheromone mixture. We'd also created a garden in the courtyard, with my bees providing essential pollination. Things were working. We were building something sustainable. But not everyone appreciated our methodical approach. A man named Garrett, who'd been a construction foreman before the outbreak, grew increasingly vocal about what he called wasting resources on bug farming. We should be clearing out the town, house by house, he argued during a community meeting, establishing a larger secure zone, not hiding behind invisible bee fences hoping the monsters don't figure out how to cross them. Our resources are limited, Elena countered. Zeke's method requires minimal ammunition, minimal risk to our people. His method is slow, Garrett shot back, and it relies on insects that could die off in a cold snap or disease. We need real security. The community was split. Some supported Garrett's more aggressive approach. Others, particularly those with scientific or agricultural backgrounds, favored my sustainable methods. Sheriff Garza tried to balance both perspectives, allocating limited resources to each approach. I kept working, improving my formulations, breeding stronger queen bees, teaching others the basics of apiculture. I developed an alarm system using bee activity levels to detect approaching infected before they reached our perimeter. I created portable bee bombs that could be thrown to divert infected in an emergency. But Garrett's faction grew more resentful. They wanted more ammunition allocated to clearing operations, more people assigned to their security teams, less focus on my bee projects. Tensions rose daily. I should have recognized the signs earlier, the whispers, the sideways glances. When people are scared, they want immediate solutions, and bees take time. I didn't know then how far some would go to undermine what I was building. On the 15th day, Elena and I were processing a new batch of pheromone mixture when Sheriff Garza burst into the lab. "We've got a problem," he said grimly. "Someone broke into the armory last night, took most of our ammunition, several rifles, and a good portion of our medical supplies." "Garrett?" Elena asked. Sheriff Garza nodded. "Him and about 10 others. They left before dawn." But the theft wasn't all they'd done. When I checked my hives that morning, I found 3 of them damaged. The frames knocked loose, queens missing. It was deliberate sabotage, designed to cripple our defensive capabilities while Garrett's group established their own compound. "They're fools," Elena said as she helped me salvage what we could from the damaged hives. "They don't understand that long-term survival requires sustainable methods, not just firepower." What none of us realized was how quickly their actions would threaten everything we'd built. Their departure had weakened our security, damaged our bee-based defense system, and divided our community just when unity was most crucial. The aftermath of Garrett's departure left us scrambling to reorganize. I worked round the clock to rehabilitate the damaged hives, combining weakened colonies to create stronger ones. Elena helped, her medical expertise proving surprisingly valuable in assessing the health of the remaining queens. Sheriff Garza reorganized security rotations to compensate for our reduced numbers. Despite the setback, we adapted. We heard nothing from Garrett's group for 5 days. Then, on the morning of the 20th day, a single member of his team stumbled back to our gates. His name was Marcus, a former postal worker who'd always seemed reluctant about Garrett's aggressive approach. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified. After Elena treated him, he told us what had happened. "Garrett led us to the shopping center on the north side of town," Marcus explained. "We cleared it of infected and set up base in the sporting goods store. It was working at first. We had good sight lines, plenty of supplies, but Garrett wasn't satisfied with securing just the shopping center. He wanted to expand, to clear adjacent buildings. They used gunfire to draw infected away from areas they wanted to secure, then eliminated them systematically. The strategy worked initially, but each gunshot drew more infected from further away. 3 days ago, we drew too many, Marcus continued. Hundreds came from every direction. We used most of our ammunition just holding them back. 4 people died trying to secure an escape route. He looked at me with haunted eyes. Garrett kept saying your bee methods were too slow, but at least they were quiet. Our guns just kept bringing more of them. Marcus had escaped during the night, making his way back to us through back roads and alleyways. He believed most of the others were still alive, barricaded in the sporting goods store but surrounded and running out of supplies. Sheriff Garza called a community meeting. "We have a decision to make," he announced. "Do we attempt a rescue, putting our own people at risk, or do we focus on securing what we have here?" The debate was heated. Some argued we couldn't abandon fellow survivors, regardless of their previous actions. Others pointed out the extreme risk of approaching an area known to be swarming with infected. In the end, Sheriff Garza made the call. "We'll send a small team, volunteers only. Fast vehicles, minimal engagement with the infected, in and out quickly." I volunteered immediately, along with Elena and 4 others. We spent the rest of the day preparing. I created concentrated pheromone repellents for each team member and several portable bee bombs. Elena packed medical supplies for the injured we expected to find. We set out at dawn the next day, taking 2 pickup trucks. Sheriff Garza led the mission himself. The plan was simple. Approach quietly, use the bee bombs to create a diversion, get Garrett's people out, and return before midday. Nothing went as planned. We were within sight of the shopping center when we heard the engines. 3 motorcycles roaring toward us from a side street. Garrett and 2 others driving at full speed with dozens of infected in pursuit. They saw us and changed direction, heading straight for our trucks. Behind them, the horde of infected grew as more joined the pursuit, drawn by the motorcycle noise. There had to be at least 100 of them. "We need to move," Sheriff Garza ordered. "Back to the school now." "What about the others?" I asked. "The rest of Garrett's group?" Garrett reached us, skidding his motorcycle to a stop. "There are no others," he shouted. "We're all that's left. Now go." We drove back to the school with the motorcycles following, the horde of infected pursuing us the entire way. Every time we thought we'd lost them, the noise of the motorcycles would draw them back on our trail. By the time we reached the school perimeter, the horde had grown to terrifying proportions. My bee-based perimeter wasn't designed to repel that many infected at once. The pheromone concentration would be diluted by their sheer numbers. As we rushed through the gates, I knew we had minutes at most before they broke through. "Everyone inside," Sheriff Garza ordered as the infected reached the outer perimeter. To my amazement, the first line of defense held. The infected paused, confused by the pheromone barrier. But their numbers kept growing, pushing from behind. "It won't hold," I told Elena as we watched from a second-floor window. "There are too many." And then I remembered something from my grandfather's teachings about bees. When faced with certain predators too large to repel, honeybees sometimes engage in a behavior called balling, surrounding the threat and vibrating their flight muscles to generate deadly heat. "We need to concentrate them," I said suddenly. "Draw them to one location away from the school." I ran to my lab and grabbed my remaining honey reserves, mixing them with herbs I'd discovered enhanced the attractant properties. Elena followed, helping me load the mixture into containers. "This will draw them?" she asked. "Like nothing you've ever seen," I replied. "But someone has to place it far enough away to pull them off our perimeter." I volunteered to drive the bait out myself, but Elena insisted on coming with me. We took my truck, loaded with the attractant mixture and our strongest pheromone repellents for personal protection. We drove out the back entrance, circling around to approach the horde from behind. I positioned the attractant about half a mile from the school, upwind so the scent would carry. As we were placing the final container, Elena suddenly cried out. An infected had emerged from a nearby building, lunging toward her. I threw myself between them, using a bee bomb to divert the infected. We ran for the truck, but more infected appeared, drawn by the commotion. We were nearly surrounded when Elena stumbled, falling hard on the asphalt. The moment seemed to stretch into eternity as I saw blood on her arm. Not from a bite, but from a deep gash where she'd caught herself on broken glass. I pulled her up, half carrying her to the truck as infected closed in from all directions. We barely made it, slamming the doors shut as hands pounded on the windows. I drove wildly, using the last of our repellent to clear a path back to the school. Behind us, the attractant began working, pulling infected away from the school perimeter toward the stronger scent. When we returned, Elena's arm was bleeding heavily. The wound itself wasn't infected, but it was deep, requiring immediate attention. As our makeshift medical team treated her, I watched from the window as my plan unfolded. The horde was diverting, moving away from the school toward our bait. But the victory came at a terrible cost. We'd lost several more hives in the chaos. Our perimeter was weakened, and Elena's injury became infected despite our best efforts with limited antibiotics. By the 25th day, we were in crisis. Elena was fighting a high fever. Our defenses were compromised. And Garrett, rather than showing gratitude for the rescue, was already pushing for leadership, arguing that his aggressive approach was being validated by the deteriorating situation. As I watched Elena struggling against infection, I realized there was only one hope left. But it would mean abandoning the very people I'd sworn to protect, at least temporarily. Sometimes survival means making impossible choices. I made my decision while sitting beside Elena's bed that night, watching her fight the infection ravaging her system. We had limited antibiotics, and they weren't working well enough. What we needed was something stronger, and I knew where to find it. Before becoming a commercial beekeeper, I'd established several remote apiaries in locations across 3 states. One of those sites was only 30 miles away, at an organic herb farm where the owner had allowed me to keep specialized hives. Most importantly, that farm had a research greenhouse where they grew medicinal herbs, including several with powerful antibiotic properties that I'd used to treat bee diseases. I told Sheriff Garza my plan at sunrise. I need to retrieve specialized queens from my apiary site, I explained, and medicinal herbs for Elena. The farm should have what we need, and it's remote enough that it might be untouched. You can't go alone, he argued. It's too dangerous. I have to, I insisted. Everyone here is needed to maintain security, and frankly, I'll move faster alone. Eventually, he agreed, but only after I promised to return within 48 hours. I prepared carefully, taking concentrated bee repellent, basic supplies, and detailed maps showing back roads to avoid major infected concentrations. I left at first light on the 26th day, driving my truck cautiously through the empty streets. Once outside town, I maintained steady progress, stopping only when necessary to clear abandoned vehicles from the road or divert around groups of infected. The landscape was eerily transformed. Fields lay unharvested. Abandoned cars lined the highways. Occasionally I passed properties where infected wandered aimlessly, trapped by fences they lacked the intelligence to climb or open. By mid-afternoon, I reached the herb farm. From a distance, it looked undisturbed. No movement, no signs of destruction. I approached cautiously, using binoculars to scan for threats before driving up the long driveway. The greenhouses were intact. My hives, positioned at the edge of lavender fields, appeared untouched. I checked the main house first, confirming it was empty before proceeding to the apiary. My specialized queens were still there. These weren't ordinary honeybees. They were a strain I'd spent years developing, known for their resistance to disease and exceptional pheromone production. Their genetic line would be crucial for rebuilding our defenses. I worked quickly, gathering equipment to transport 4 queen bees safely. Then, I moved to the greenhouses, collecting medicinal herbs and seeds. The golden seal and echinacea alone would substantially improve our medical capabilities. As I was loading the truck, I heard a vehicle approaching. I took cover, watching as an old pickup truck came slowly up the driveway. 2 people sat inside, a middle-aged woman and a teenage boy. They stopped near the house, scanning the property nervously. The woman held a shotgun, but her posture wasn't threatening. She looked exhausted, desperate. I emerged cautiously, hands visible. "I'm not infected," I called, "just gathering supplies." The woman lowered her gun slightly. "We've been traveling for days," she said, "looking for somewhere safe." Her name was Diane. The boy was her son, Cooper. They'd fled their home when neighbors turned, eventually running out of gas nearby and continuing on foot until they found the herb farm. "There's a community," I told them. "About 30 miles south. We have secure shelter, food, medicine." Hope flickered in their eyes. I helped them gather additional supplies from the farm, then offered them a ride back to the school. As we traveled, I explained our bee-based defenses. Cooper, it turned out, had participated in a 4-H beekeeping program before the outbreak. His knowledge, though basic, would be valuable. We returned to the school late on the 27th day. The gate guards were initially suspicious of the newcomers, but Sheriff Garza remembered that I'd mentioned possibly finding survivors and had instructed them to expect me with company. I rushed to the infirmary with the medicinal herbs. Elena was conscious but weak, her fever still dangerously high. The school's former biology teacher helped me prepare poultices and tinctures from the herbs I'd brought. Within hours, we began to see improvement as the natural antibiotics fought Elena's infection. Over the next day, I worked relentlessly to integrate my specialized queens into our remaining hives. The process was delicate. Worker bees sometimes reject new queens, but with careful introduction techniques, all 4 queens were accepted. Their genetics would strengthen our colonies and improve the efficacy of our defense systems. On the 29th day, Elena was strong enough to leave her bed. We walked slowly around the school courtyard, observing the improvements to our apiary. "Your trip may have saved more than just me," she commented, watching the enhanced bee activity around the new hives. "These colonies will produce better pheromones?" "Much better," I confirmed. "And they're more resilient to disease and environmental stress. Within weeks, we'll have stronger defensive capabilities than before." She squeezed my hand, looking out at the community garden where Cooper was helping younger children plant seeds I'd brought back. "When I was feverish, I had a vision," she said quietly. "I saw fields of flowers with bees moving between them. Behind the fields were walls of hives protecting communities of people. It seemed so real." "It could be real," I told her. "Bees have survived on Earth for over 100 million years. They've outlasted countless catastrophes. They'll outlast this one too." By the 30th day, we'd established a new equilibrium at the school. Garrett, chastened by the failure of his aggressive approach, had reluctantly acknowledged the value of my methods. Sheriff Garza implemented a balanced security strategy that incorporated both conventional defenses and our bee-based systems. Using the seeds and plant material I'd retrieved, we expanded our gardens to include medicinal herbs and additional food crops. Cooper's enthusiasm for beekeeping inspired several other community members to learn the craft, giving us enough trained personnel to maintain and expand our apiaries. The specialized queens thrived, producing stronger worker bees that generated more effective pheromones. We created an enhanced perimeter that even large groups of infected wouldn't penetrate. We developed portable protection units using concentrated pheromones that allowed scavenging teams to operate with greater safety. When Elena fully recovered, she began systematic research into why the infected responded to bee pheromones. Her hypothesis was that the infection affected the same neurological pathways that certain insects use to detect threats, essentially triggering a primitive avoidance response. Her work promised to yield even more effective repellents. In this broken world, my bees weren't just survivors like us. They were teachers. They showed us how to build something lasting from destruction. Their complex social structure, their resilience, their ability to adapt, these were qualities we needed to emulate. I often think back to that morning at the Johnson orchard when everything changed. How strange that my specialized knowledge, considered obscure and unimportant in the old world, became essential in the new one. How fortunate that I chose to stay with my bees rather than fleeing to cities where millions died. Every day we stay alive is another day we can rebuild. And maybe, just maybe, in saving the bees, we'll end up saving ourselves. The infected may roam the earth now, but they won't forever. Humanity has been knocked down, but with the lessons my bees teach daily, cooperation, adaptation, resilience, we're building something that will endure. We're not just survivors anymore. We're the beginning of something new, something better. A world where we work with nature's systems rather than against them. A world protected by the humble honeybee. And as I look out at our thriving community, watching children learn to tend hives and gardens flourishing with bee-pollinated crops, I know we'll make it. Not because we're stronger or smarter than the infected, but because we're part of something larger than ourselves. A system that's been perfecting itself since long before humans walked the earth. The world ended that April morning, yes, but another world began too. And in this new world, the soft buzzing of bees isn't just the sound of nature at work, it's the sound of hope.